Welcome everybody to the Retrofit Coordinator Summit. It's the first online event I've ever organised, so I'm more nervous than I've been organising an event in about 20 years. It's great to have, we've got 71 participants at the minute, and I think we might pick up a few more as we go. We have got a couple of hours to go through things, so but we've got an awful lot of questions that have come in, and I'm sure we're going to get more as we go. What we're going to do is we are recording this session, okay? So be aware of that, because if any of you are uncomfortable about being recorded and then sort of broadcast, just be aware of that. Flag up with me anything that you desperately didn't want to be included and regretted saying. But we are going to record it, and we are going to share it, because obviously there's the people on this call, and then there's the people who couldn't make this call, many of whom need to know the same information. What we're aiming to do is to try and head off or address head on some of the key questions that have been raised over the last sort of 3 or 4 months. Often I hear the same questions repeated, and I provide an answer, and then I talk to some of my fellow panelists here, and I say, this is what I said, what would you say? And usually we agree, but I think if the members of this panel do agree, then I think we've got a fairly good steer, providing fairly good steer and some clarity. Anything we can't answer, we'll undertake to take away, find an answer to, and reply to you, okay? So we won't, there's no, not going to be any of the sort of bullshit on this call. If we don't know, we'll find out and we'll get back to you. Just to remind you, the only people who should have their video turned on the call are members of the panel. So if you're not on the panel, could you please make sure that your microphones are muted and that your video is turned off? And to do that, you'll see when you hover your mouse over the screen, there's some buttons that appear at the base. Where it says stop video, please press stop video. And where it says mute, please press mute. Okay, nice and simple. We will be an opportunity for you to ask questions later, and you'll unmute your microphone at that point, but we don't want to be using the video, okay? You'll also see there's a button that says polls, and at a few different points over the next couple of hours, I'm going to pull that up, and you'll have a chance to respond to various polls and see the results of those polls, which is quite exciting, but I have a feeling that all sorts of things could go wrong. I'm going to now share my screen. So I'm hoping you're now seeing a PowerPoint presentation.
We can.
Great stuff. Before we get going, just thanks to a couple of organisations that have helped with this, and which will be of interest to retrofit coordinators. The first is RetroBook, which is a new app-based service which is designed to connect retrofit coordinators and clients and installers. You can download that from the App Store just by searching for RetroBook, and well worth taking a look at. It's still in beta testing, but it's now got some live jobs posted on it, so well worth getting on to. And also to Osmosis, which is the consultancy dedicated to scaling up whole house retrofit. That's one of the hats that I wear, and a few other people involved in this call are involved in. Some good news for all retrofit coordinators is that BSI have agreed to offer a 50% discount on the PAS 2030 and PAS 2035 standard. For retrofit coordinators. That offer is available from today until the 20th of July initially, and you can get that discount by entering that promo code PAS50 at the checkout at the BSI store. It's well worth a read, and I think we feel that every practicing retrofit coordinator should own a copy of it, and you won't get that deal anywhere else, I'm told. So that's I think it will end up costing about £90 doing it that way rather than 180. Okay, the format of the session is that we split we're basing this very much on question time. We've split question time into 3 sections. The first, section 1, is all about implementing PAS 2030 and PAS 2035. So what are the challenges in doing that? What are the sticking points people are finding? What are the questions that you must have answers to? The second one is around technical best practice. And the third one is around the eco and the future of what we'll call the whole house retrofit market, which we'll come on to explain shortly. When we've got through that, now we've had lots and lots of questions, and they all sort of group into those 3 themes. When we're through that, we'll then throw it open to those on the call to see if there are any further questions, and we'll finish off with some closing remarks and a discussion with the panel. Now, if at any time you have a question, you think, I want to ask that, but I'm going to forget if I leave it till the end, use the chat function in your browser. Again, hover over the screen, brings up buttons, one of which is chat. If you write a question in there, it will only be sent to me as the host. If you make sure you put your question and your name, I'll make sure it's referred to in those questions. Okay, so let's introduce our panel. It's a fantastic, if all male panel. We must find some ladies to sit on these things in future. But the panel consists of Dr. Peter Rickaby, who almost all of you will know through either the Retrofit Academy training or as the technical author of PAS 2035. Andre Miller, who's the head of the Energy Company Obligation at BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Nigel Donoghue, who's a chief executive. Many of you will know Nigel as the chief executive of CIGA, and I'm sure he will explain the Insulation Assurance Authority in this call. And Phil Mason is the head of compliance at Trustmark. So Phil and I and Peter sit on many groups and calls together similar to this. And again, Phil will outline his role as we go. So we're going to start off with questions around implementing PAS 2030, 2019 and PAS 2035. And just to set the scene, what I'd like to do, I've got a specific question for each member of the panel. Perhaps if you could do a little introduction to yourself whilst you're responding to these. So the first question is to Peter Rickaby, and that is, why was PAS 2035 needed in the first place? And why do we need it?
Okay, well, I suppose that flows out of the Each Home Counts review set up by 2 government departments with the real objective of restoring the confidence of the public and indeed the government in the retrofit industry following a whole chapter during the last 10 years of both large and small disasters, things that went badly wrong and caused damage or discomfort or even death. And as a consequence of that, one of the outcomes of the Each Home Counts review, alongside the need to set up the quality market Trustmark, which Phil will talk about, was the idea of having a suite or a framework of technical standards for retrofit that everybody could sign up to and that would help us to do a better job, perhaps give a bit more consideration to the work, and therefore restore the confidence of the public so we can get them to start working on their houses, restore the confidence of the government so they can set up some policies to support that, and particularly to restore the confidence of the finance industry, whose view at the moment is that there's plenty of money to be lent to individual households or indeed to housing organisations to do retrofit with, but only if we take the risk out of it. Because at the moment, or certainly before PAS 2035, and each home counts, the funding industry, the finance industry viewed retrofit as too big a risk to lend into.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question is for Phil Mason. And it's, what are the government, BSI and Trustmark intending to achieve with PAS 2035? And what are the timescales to its implementation?
Okay, right. I think really it's about trying to bring a consistent approach to the delivery of retrofit. Figures do vary a little bit, but we've got somewhere in the region of about 24 million existing properties that are going to need various levels of retrofit, depending on the EPC rating they already have, over the next 30 years in order to support the government ambition of net zero by 2050. And I think because Trustmark is licensed back to BEIS, and because BEIS have sponsored the production of PAS 2035, it seems to be a natural relationship that we become the delivery vehicle for the compliance around PAS 2035 and the requirement of the standards for people that are within the Trustmark scheme, and that links back to the fact that we're the government endorsed quality scheme. So really, it's the opportunity now to bring a consistent, recognised approach for retrofit, so that we don't get 4 or 5 years down the line retrofitting these high numbers of properties and finding out that the process was either not existent or was broken. And I realise there's some challenges around the new requirements of PAS 2035 from industry about the implementation, but I think that's something that as we start to progress through this over the next 12 months, that we can then collate some of the real world issues and implement them into or support implementation into the next version of the plans, or take a view around the inclusion of them. But for me, it's about consistency. Okay. Timescales. Many people have commented on the fact that it's a very brave step, and I think it is, but I think it's the step that as Trustmark we naturally have to take. Being linked back, as I already say, back to BEIS, the implementation period for anybody, and I'm confining this statement to the Trustmark membership, but anybody that's installing retrofit measures that are within the scope of PAS 2035 via PAS 2030 will by the end of June 2021, where the transition period will cease to be, that all work delivered under retrofit under the scope of the standards by June 2021 will be compliant to the requirements of the PASs.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you very much. Next question is to Andre, and it really is how does this all relate to the energy company obligation, which you're in charge of, and why is it being introduced into the eco sector first?
Hello, everyone. So why, or how does it relate to eco? So being a Trustmark registered business is now a requirement under eco as of the 1st of January. So we consulted on that requirement, and indeed we've trailed the fact that the new PASs will be a requirement under eco ever since the current iteration of it was introduced in 2018, December 2018. Then we had a consultation last year once the details of the PASs were clear, and once Trustmark, as in its current iteration, was established. So what we have now, as Phil mentioned, is a period of people working both under the 2017 standards and some people working under the new standards, what we're calling the transition period. And as of the 1st of July 2021, everyone who is installing under eco will have to work to those new standards. Why eco? Fundamentally, it's because we have greater control in the retrofit sector within eco than anywhere else. So people who just fund things themselves, it's harder to introduce new standards into that sector. Obviously, eco, whilst it's not direct government funded, it's funded by all of us as much as it goes on consumer bills. So there is a very real feeling that we need to have the best possible standards if everyone is funding it, not least because it's focused on low-income and vulnerable households. And to some extent, it's also a test bed. So first of all, we can quite easily put extra requirements into eco, but also we can see how it works on a relatively large scale, and then potentially implement it into other schemes. And I know we've got questions about the future coming up, but you know, this very much from our perspective is a first step, and we shall see what policies come forward, but certainly we don't think eco is the only step in introducing these standards.
Okay, thank you very much. Final question is to Nigel, and this is about how PAS 2030 and PAS 2035 interrelate. Now, Nigel, it'd be good if you could explain about the Insulation Assurance Agency in this context, because I think most people would still think of you as CIGA. And also, perhaps you could explain why some schemes, such as yourselves, have started to renew installers to the new standards now, whereas others don't appear to have done that yet.
Okay, thanks, David. Hi, everybody. Firstly, the Insulation Assurance, the Insulation Assurance Authority. So you'll notice as CIGA, we've been around since 1995 for insulation measures, predominantly guaranteeing cavity wall insulation, and relied quite largely on the assurance that was provided by relative certification bodies. Introduction of PAS 2030, 2014, and competent person schemes shortly after that saw us get involved in competent persons and working with partner organisations to provide the level of surveillance we needed for that. And more so, we started to take an authoritative role in terms of best practice, in terms of technical guidance. And then in 2017, we took the decision to launch our own certification body in its own right, and have continued to extend that across all insulation measures. So with the exception of Park Homes, which is the next one on my radar, we have PAS 2030 certification across all insulation measures. We continue to lead on best practice across the insulation sector, being involved from the early onset on the steering groups for PAS 2030 and 2035. The ultimate aim being to make sure that from an insulation point of view, Fabric First stays very much on the agenda as part of whole house retrofit. It's a very fundamental part of it. That as a measure, it's sustainable, and some of that relates to some of the problems we've got not only in retrofit but in new build, and to generally promote some of the things we've been doing in terms of best practice across the industry. Why have we taken the decision to go 2030 now, and the independency between 2035 and 2030? Let's cover that off first. We've always focused on, particularly in cavity wall, on a system designer-led approach, which is focused on a single measure, really. It's been a design for the installation of retrofit cavity wall insulation. It's been underpinned by an agreement certificate and a product testing regime. And then system designers have been reliant on training and carding and evidence competency for their workforce, operating to minimum technical competencies. And as the PAS have evolved, we've had the introduction of independent surveillance of assessment, which has meant we have an independent judgment on that property before it's installed to make sure it's appropriate to receive the measure. We're moving now towards MVQs, but we've got to actually focus on the impact of cavity wall or on external wall, internal wall, any of them insulation measures, the impact on that on the property itself and how they're going to interact with other measures in the future. So much so that now we've gone down the MVQ route under PAS 2030. The National Occupational Standards we're developing to underpin these measures is focusing at interface modules now. So we're taking operatives, installer technicians onto a position where not only do they need to know about the measure they're installing, but the impact that measure will have on potentially other measures as they're installed. We went down the 2030 route, partly by choice and partly by the audit cycle of UCAS. So UCAS's position is, when you are due to be audited, you're audited the new standard, and if you're audited the new standard, you can then only audit your, you can only then accredit to that standard. So when we audit any of our installers as a 2030, 2019 approved UCAS accredited body, we have to audit them that standard. We're not naive enough to believe that everybody's ready from day one, and we have to have a practical approach. Some of the occupational standards and MVQs for some of them don't yet exist. So we still have to look back at minimum technical competencies and actually come up with a plan when people will be ready to move to the new qualifications. Likewise, if people are on the transition towards getting suitably qualified retrofit coordinators, we have dispensation, which allows us to audit people and award them with a non-compliance to give them time, a 12-week period in which they can then evidence compliance and to go back and revisit that. But more and more so, you'll come across your certification bodies, if you're not under us as a certification body, they will have to take exactly that same judgment. My view is that I want our industry fully prepared. I want us to be early adopters of it, because actually I want us to benefit by being at the leading edge of it, hence our decision and the position we're in now.
Okay, thank you. That's very clear. That's great. Let's move on then to some of the questions that came from people on the call. Unfortunately, we're not going to invite people to turn their mics on and address them themselves. It's just too complicated. So I'm going to repeat their questions here. The first one, I think it would be impossible to start this discussion without this as a starting point, really. And obviously it relates to the COVID-19 situation, which has had all sorts of impacts, not least on the energy efficiency industry, not being able to go to people's homes at the minute. So a question from Michael Sweeney at Union Technical is COVID-19 likely to delay the timescales for install companies to be accredited? That's probably for Nigel and Andre. Nigel, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, my view is we've been having conversations with Andre and with BEIS around it. We've had conversations with Trustmark around it. It is going to have an impact as we move to get people qualified using online learning, less face-to-face engagement. We're aware that there is a backlog in terms of having suitably qualified retrofit coordinators across there. The market is still sorting itself out. We've got to work with that. So we've had some concessions off Trustmark, one of them being around the lodgement of jobs that were pre-notified and pre-assessed prior to transition. That's good breathing space. And for those who aren't aware of that, that gives us, I'm trying to think of the date period now. It gives us, is it 3 or 6 weeks, Phil, from the date of notification as of the 3rd of April?
60 days.
60 days.
60 days.
So yes, that's some breathing space in terms of lodgement of them jobs, if you find them jobs under 2017 and assess them under it. We're still discussing with Andre how we can come up with practical works with UCAS in terms of how we assess somebody who's been ready and at the point they're ready. And I'm still of the view, and it's the shared view, but I'm still of the view that we've got to reflect on 2 standards until people are ready to go to the standard, and it's certification bodies who should have the plan for that migration strategy. So we should be working with installer companies, and we should be sharing with them what they need to do to be fully compliant and supporting them through that process. But we can't let it drift. We can't let this just go on and wait for it to.
Okay.
2021.
Phil, any thoughts?
Well, if we go back to the 60 days, it's I don't think grace period is quite the term to use, but if there's work already in the pipeline that's been, as Nigel says, surveyed and everything that goes with it and priced against PAS 2030, and then a business comes along and is transitioned to PAS 2030, 2019, where PAS 2035 kicks in, it does create a little bit of an issue for a business, because it's got to go back and sort of realign all its jobs and the work that it's already done. So I think if we take that as perhaps an example of a level of practical sort of common sense that can be applied to a set of circumstances, I think that's a good example, because the conversation's open between BEIS and UCAS and ourselves. I think there's a wider conversation to be had, and we've published those changes in support of the business. We're talking about 60 days, and one of the, I suppose, a concern that I might have is because of and I think we probably all share it collectively, is because of the lockdown period. There is a possibility that the lockdown period might, if the lockdown period lasts exactly 60 days, the flexibility has been changed. So we've agreed to be able to review that. Now, if we just take that as an example where we look at the challenges that are presented to industry, I don't think this is about kicking PAS 2035 down the road at all, because I don't think any of us can afford to do that. But it's about working through, understanding the circumstances as they unfold, and trying to pragmatically react to those as we go forward. So at the moment, I don't think there's any plan to delay timescales based on where we sit today. But I think that's a decision. There has to be an open decision that has to be revisited depending on the circumstances over the next few weeks and months. And talking to the trade and understanding some of the practical issues that they have. What we don't want to do is lose measures or lose businesses, because times are really tough now, but we've got to stay true to the principles and the timescales that are there, unless there's justification for revisiting them, I think.
Okay, that's fine. Anyone else? Andre, do you have any comment on that?
I think I'd absolutely echo what Bill just said, that we think PAS 2035 is the right thing, the new standards, the new PAS 2030 is the right thing to do. We haven't got plans immediately to change the requirements of for eco. You know, that transition period, as far as we're concerned, will be until the 1st of July next year. However, within that, absolutely, we will consider whether there are further flexibilities we can and it's appropriate to introduce, because and it's hard, you know, it is hard to tell where we'll be in 2-3 months time. You know, we will absolutely have to take stock of how many retrofit coordinators there are, how people are progressing, but also recognizing that whilst there's a hiatus, that makes it difficult also to learn from how the standards are being employed.
Sure, that's great. I want to move on now to a theme that keeps coming up it's raised by retrofit coordinators all the time, and that relates to insurance. It's just been raised again by Vince. Thanks for that, Vince. But I have a couple of existing questions as well. The first is from Alex Hunt, a retrofit coordinator in Brighton, and he says, will retrofit coordinators have to bear the brunt of any future insurance claims if a contractor substitutes materials in the course of a build? I'm going to point that at Mr. Rickaby, I think. Maybe unfairly.
No, that's fine. Well, there is a provision in PAS 2035 that says that substitutions cannot be made without the retrofit coordinator's approval. That's actually in PAS 2030 as well. So if the installer or the contractor wants to change something, has to go back through the process to the retrofit coordinator, who may well consult the retrofit designer for approval before it can be agreed. If that process goes through, then as far as I can see, the retrofit coordinator has just done his job. And if it happens to be a wrong decision to agree the change, then the retrofit coordinator would be liable for making a wrong decision, do something professionally inappropriate. If, however, it's done without the retrofit coordinator's approval, I don't think the retrofit coordinator would bear the brunt at all, because it would be the contractor who'd made an unauthorized alteration to the approved retrofit design.
Okay.
Can I just chip in there on that?
Yeah.
I've got a few thoughts about it, and I always compare it to the probably thankless task of the local authority building control, the local authority building inspector that comes around and does inspections, and he can see what he can see, and he can put his checks in, and he can gather his evidence, and he can ask his questions. And if something happens behind the scenes that he couldn't possibly know about, I think that seems rather unfair to lumber that on the retrofit coordinator. One thing that I would just observe by it, though, I think if a good contract is put in place with a good supply chain beneath the retrofit coordinator, and good compliance processes and monitoring of what's happening with the project, that negates the chance of these things happening. I don't think you can ever legislate absolutely everything out, because there is a possibility that an unscrupulous contractor could carry out various activities without the retrofit coordinator's knowledge, because he or she can't be there of every minute of every project. But what it throws up for me is the need for good compliance and good management of projects, with suitable contracts in place that define responsibilities, and just really sort of working on good relationships and good compliance within those projects. I believe is a big part of mitigating those risks.
Okay, agreed. The follow-on question is from Vincent Brissenden, a retrofit coordinator from the Bristol area. He says, are there any guidelines on what level of public liability insurance a coordinator should carry? And do the insurance industry understand what a retrofit coordinator does to the extent that they can provide appropriate cover? Who should we throw this one at? Sounds like a Nigel question to me. Nigel, could I ask you to talk straight to the camera and not turn your head away, because it's lovely and clear when you do and it goes quiet when you don't.
Okay. Yeah, apologies. I did have a text to confirm that. What I would say is, anecdotally, the insurance industry don't know what a retrofit coordinator is. I think there's some work to do, and I think it's about how that's presented to insurance companies. It's an area that companies have struggled, and certainly in the insulation sector, around PI insurance in the past, to get the level that they need and that is necessary. Clearly, people are doing it. People have set it up, retrofit coordinator services, which tells me they are getting the appropriate insurance and they're working among schemes. Phil is probably better versed than that one. But we operate at a model at the moment where our minimum PI is 5 million. I would expect probably under this service it needs to be close to 10 million.
I just have a thought, and it's only, I don't know if we probably won't be able to actually answer it now, but to assist the insurance industry's understanding of PAS 2035 and the role of a retrofit coordinator, I can't help but wonder whether, I don't know if this is going to be taken as a good or a bad idea, but whether there should be an invite to elements of the insurance industry to the PAS 2035 steering group, because it would open their eyes to the role, to both the risks and the assurances that it brings. I mean, it's only a suggestion, and I'm not really sure that we can sort of agree or disagree that here and now, but it's just a thought, so that we collectively as an industry can engage with the insurance industry and help them in their understanding.
Okay, good thought.
I would support that actually, David, because the insurance industry tends to price things high when they're new. But the whole point, the whole dilemma we've got here is that this whole new process is to de-risk the situation. So risks that have been inherent in retrofit in the past should not be there to the same extent. So we should be able to convince the industry that this is a good thing for them and not a bad thing for them, and not something they want to load premiums for. And I agree with Phil, getting the insurance industry on board is going to be quite an important task.
Okay, I want to move on now to some specific questions we've had around the role of retrofit coordinator, and this is an area that's quite fluid, and I think we're all still working out what is in scope and what is not in scope for a coordinator. The first question is quite a straightforward one, I think probably best answered by Peter. It says, as a qualified retrofit coordinator, can you provide evaluation services to other retrofit coordinators as part of the monitoring and evaluation process? Yes. Thought so.
No problem at all, provided you've got the qualification, absolutely right.
Okay, so where are we with retrofit evaluators at the moment?
BSI has scoped and is currently funding a new standard called Building Performance Evaluation, which will cover not just retrofit and domestic, but also non-domestic and new build. So it's going to be a big standard. It'll take a couple of years to happen, but as part of that standard, we will be specifying qualifications for retrofit, well, for evaluators, and we will then be in a position to choose to adopt those in a future edition of PAS 2035. It's not going to happen at the forthcoming update this year. It's going to be a couple of years down the line. So I'd say probably the next one. Okay. And then we will replace that qualification.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Brian McKevitt from Energy Saving Installers. He says, can the retrofit coordinator also be the designer if correctly qualified? Can a retrofit designer, being a member of the CIOB, carry out our design work on all low, medium and high risk measures?
The answer to that is yes as well, provided he meets the qualification in Annex A of the PAS. Yeah. But there's absolutely no reason why the coordinator can't also be be the designer. And in fact, the idea of a retrofit coordinator came from the RIBA originally as a new role for architects in retrofit. So it's absolutely fine.
Yeah, great.
Something that we've posted up on the Trustmark website, it's been there for some duration, and we've not had any feedback one way or the other around it. What we tried to do was map the pathways, the risk pathways of the PAS, and then put a column in that put the qualifications in against the pathways, against the tasks. And I think, from memory, that's something that's it's on the Trustmark website, and it's called PAS 2035. Well, rather unimaginatively, roles and qualifications. So if somebody wanted to see a pathway of how the qualifications work in a sort of tabulated format, it's available. And equally, what I would say, that's our interpretation of, and quite a polished interpretation, I believe, of what we've taken from the PAS. So if anybody finds it and there is any feedback one way or the other, we'd be very welcome to receive that, because what we've tried to do is just take it from the paragraphs in the PAS and then sort of map it in a slightly more pictorial way.
Yeah, okay. Just going back briefly to insurance, we've had a number of people message in with subsequent questions. Alex comments that he's been trying to get insurance for several months now as a coordinator. He says here, I don't think he means this, but he's just got an offer for £1. I think he means 1 million or 2 million. And he dreads to think what the cost for 5 to 10 million might be. This seems to be a big issue. So I think we should undertake that we'll go away and do some proper work on this and come back with a coherent response.
Can I just say as well, it's really about the kind of projects people are going to engage in as well. So I think we need to take a view across not only the risk pathway, but actually, the value side of the projects as well. You take something like high rise compared to a range of sort of masonry dwellings.
This is a key theme, I think, Nigel. This one size fitting all. We're going to come back to that soon. We've got a few practical questions around the PAS to cover. First one is: do we have to carry out an air tightness test on every property with a medium or high risk measure installed? Who wants to take that one? Tempted to say Peter.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Answer to that is no. The only requirement for an air pressure test is in risk path C, not in B. I think there's a recommendation that you should consider it in B, but you don't have to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. Enough said on that, I think. A specific question on high rise here from Emma Adams at ARP, who I know are all about ropes and abseiling and all sorts of daring things. She says, we are a specialist cavity wall installer using rope access for high rise blocks. Is there anything specific in the guidance for retrofitting blocks of flats? She says she's aware of the building regs revised fire safety rating for CWI and blocks over 18 metres. But is there any further guidance? Anyone want to take that one? Maybe too specific a point, I suggest.
Well, there are in PAS 2035 some concessions with regard to assessment of blocks of flats. You can make one assessment of the whole block instead of flat by flat, but there's nothing else that's special to blocks.
Okay.
A high-rise block would, of course, nearly always be in path C, though, so it's the most onerous path through the PAS.
Okay. Emma, if you're on the call, if you want to send me a chat message with perhaps a clarification of what you're looking for, we can revisit it. A couple of questions from housing associations. As usual, the Retrofit Coordinator community, we've got a very broad range of organisations represented on the call here today, and housing associations are always prevalent amongst those. This question says, as a housing association, will this, for which he says whole house retrofit or PAS 2035, affect our ability to obtain funding via Eco3 or other funding routes for retrofit projects? Any takers?
Well, so from an eco perspective, it shouldn't it shouldn't restrict you. I mean, it may be that there are, well, not it may, it's almost inevitable there'll be higher costs associated with meeting the new standards, and that is what we expect, and we've priced that in terms of anticipating prices. Now, we accept that there may be a situation where during this period where people are working to the old standards, some are working to the new standards, there may be some disadvantages in working to the new standards. We've tried to at least offset that with there's an uplift basically during this period before the 1st of July next year. If you work to the new standards, you get under ECO as a supplier, you get more for your measure, so you get a 20% uplift on the score that you'd normally get, and we would anticipate that feeds through to the supply chain. So yeah, there shouldn't be an issue on the eco side. On other aspects, again, it's recognizing that there is likely to be a greater cost to implementing new standard, but again, it's up to you to consider what the benefits of that are, and we've come up against, I wouldn't say a brick wall, but there's been a bit of a difficulty in us evaluating the benefits of this, because when we do a cost benefit analysis of retrofit, we assume that everything is done as it should be, and in some degree these new standards are just making doubly sure that people are doing what they maybe should have been doing before. So there are extra checks in place. It's quite hard for us to say the benefits of these new standards quantified are X, but we certainly can look at past failures, what the costs are of putting things right where they have gone wrong. So from that perspective, I think it's for housing associations to do a similar cost benefit analysis.
Okay, thank you very much.
David, can I just jump in and just give two penneth on this one?
Yeah.
I think as an industry and those operating in eco, there's a significant investment in this to gear up and to get to the required standard, and actually to earn that Trustmark badge as well. And I think we'd be failing if we didn't keep pressure on government to ensure that whatever comes next in terms of legislation, whatever comes next in Scotland in terms of moving to EPC C and having requirements that future home sales are predicated on achieving an energy efficiency standard, if we allow that to happen without this being embedded into it, and we allow a lesser market to exist, we've failed. Because actually the investment here is to gear the people that we work with to be the very best in class, and by default they deserve to benefit from this. So it's incumbent on us all to make sure that this standard goes across the board and broader, and that housing associations don't take the conscious decision not to take a funding on an EWI measure because they don't want the hassle factor. It's there for a reason. It's there for whole house retrofit. It's there to protect building infrastructure in the future.
Okay, thank you. There's a follow-on question here around housing associations and funding. It's really, I think this question is getting at whether it's appropriate for a housing association to employ a retrofit coordinator in-house, or whether they would see that being carried out by an installer or an independent third party. Peter, would you see it as being appropriate?
Yes, I mean, I would like to encourage all housing associations to have in-house retrofit coordinators amongst their asset management surveyors and those kind of people. It would seem to me to be the right thing to do, but they're perfectly at liberty to employ an external independent retrofit coordinator if they wish, and they're perfectly at liberty to make it part of their framework contract that whoever's doing their framework installer work could also provide the retrofit coordinator. I think it would be better if they were in-house, but it's not a requirement.
Okay, that's great. I think that's very clear. We're going to run a poll. I want to keep us on time. and we're going to run the poll in a second. Just whilst we're doing that poll and people are having to think, there's 3 questions. You're going to respond with one answer to each of those questions. I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. Whilst people are doing that, can I just pose a question to the panel to have a think about? And that is there not a real danger at this point of time that this whole endeavour, which is about, I think now 5.5 years at least, to get from where we were at the end of Green Deal to where we are now, is there not a danger that we're just going to be left with a sort of a tick box exercise as the end result of it? And what are the dangers of that? I'm going to put the poll up on screen now, just bear with me. Okay, so I'm hoping now on your screen you're seeing 3 questions. I'll give you 30 seconds to answer those, and then I shall share the results. Can you see them?
Yes.
Great. It currently says 0 of 85 have voted. Oh, we've got our first vote. There we go. It's working. They're coming through now. Oh, this is fantastic. Okay, give it some more time because they're racing in. Okay, so Phil, just whilst they're coming in, let's continue. So this danger of it becoming a tick box exercise, what are your views on that?
Okay, I think we've got to be very, very careful that we don't end up as something being a tick box exercise, because the benefits that can be achieved through the PAS just will not translate out into the standards of work that's carried out. Now, as you know, we've got a number of retrofit coordinator schemes that have emerged, and they're fledgling schemes. It's new for them as it is for everybody else, but I think Smart's role in all of this, and it's one of education, and it's one of encouragement, but is to work incredibly closely with those schemes through the working group to ensure that there's a consistency across the schemes, that we're working to one common standard. And I realise there's challenge and work to be put in through all of that, but my fear is, and worry is, that if it goes unchecked, we lose the opportunity to gain the benefit. And I think there's a big responsibility on Trustmark to be approachable, but to be very, very clear with the schemes that are now delivering retrofit coordinator registration, that we work very closely with them. And if we sense that somebody's struggling, I think we need to be able to be there to help. But if we sense that the standards are starting to slip in a particular area, and we had a weaker scheme, then the temptation from less scrupulous individuals in industry are to go to those schemes, and we can't afford that to happen, because, as you say, it's been a long time, it's been a huge amount of resource, and I think it's a sort of it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to actually deliver something that works and actually makes a difference. So I think there's a lot of focus on, I mean, it's a big responsibility, and it lies with us, and it is for us to be approachable and yet strong with the schemes to make sure that we get consistent and consistently high standards of registration and monitoring of retrofit coordinators. And if we find shortfalls within it through the schemes, I think there's an educational process, and it's a sort of industry learning process as well. With there has to be some tolerance, but I don't think we can water something down.
Okay, that's great. Let's just hold thoughts for any further thoughts on that whilst we see what our attendees make of it.
Wow.
So we're seeing the survey results. We had 75 people vote. So in terms of, do people think that PAS 2035 is just going to go away in effect, or is it going to be full and enforced? Almost half there are saying, well, 2/3 are saying yes, it will be mandatory and applied. Almost 50% or 45% saying in full. 34% saying in a watered down way. 21% saying no, it will be delayed, but nobody saying no, it will be scrapped, which isn't what people say to me when they're not polling online. I have to say, there are some people out there who certainly think this is all going to go away, but no one on this call does. Question 2, to what extent do you apply PAS 2035 and its key principles in your business? So I think what we see there is very much that people are in transition towards that, which reflects that some of them are working their way through the coordinator course. So 11% saying no, they don't apply those principles, and 7% saying we don't understand it yet. So suspect those 7% haven't started the course yet, or perhaps need to have a chat with us. And finally, do you think that PAS 2035 will help grow the market for deep retrofit? Well, this is encouraging, I think. So we've got over 90% there saying yes, massively, which is what we need, of course, or yes, but only to a limited extent. And one person saying no, the market will shrink. And again, I actually hear slightly more negativity around that theme than I'm seeing here. But very encouraging. Any reflections from the panel on those results? Or are they as we'd expect?
Well, that last one is positive. I mean, I absolutely think that it needs to carry on. It needs to expand, because the opportunity is massive. You know, we need to insulate all these homes. But there are going to be very difficult decisions for politicians over the next 5-10 years about how we do it. And I think the current situation will make that harder. Where is it? How is it going to come? You know, either it's subsidy or it's some sort of requirement or regulation, or and you can have tax incentives or tax disincentives. But they're all going to be difficult decisions for ministers, and they're going to be made much more difficult if they perceive that, in actual fact, 10% of retrofit fails, to the extent that, you know, people's health is put it at risk, and they will not be able to put massive subsidy schemes or regulatory requirements in place unless they can trust that people won't be put in danger, or they won't be criticised for requirements that make people's lives worse. And also, even without the political aspect, you know, the positive side of things is if the finance industry trusts that this is working, they are much more likely to come in and help sort of solve the problem in a way for government, if there's lots of financing and low cost finance coming into the sector. So I think we have to. I recognise there are difficulties, and I'm not at the coalface of this, but I think it's absolutely essential that this goes forward.
Agreed. Okay, we need to move forward at this point, otherwise we're going to run badly over time. Just to say to Adrian Wright and to Guy Ritson, I've noted your questions, and they're both covered as we progress. I'll make sure we do address those points. So let's move on then to this theme of technical excellence and best practice. We should get through this section fairly quickly because there aren't as many questions, and I think they're fairly straightforward answers. Just to set the scene, I'm going to ask the panel a specific question. To Mr. Rickaby, I'd really think we'd find it very helpful if you could just explain what this term whole house retrofit means, and not the 30 slides we take to do this in the Retrofit Coordinator course, but what's the definition of whole house retrofit, and how is it different to current practice?
It's a good question, because there's lots of confusion about it, and whole house retrofit does not mean everything at once, and there are still some people in Bay who think it does. But actually, whole house retrofit means having a plan for retrofitting the whole house by 2050 or sometime, and working towards it in a way, setting off in the right direction and doing the right thing, instead of with the way we've been doing it in the past, which has been chasing the money. Somebody comes over the horizon with a bag of money that says eco money for EWI, so that's what you get in your house, whether your house does it or not. So actually, whole house retrofit is not about doing it at once. It's about having a plan, doing a whole house assessment, working out what the house needs by 2050, putting the measures in order of priority, looking at the interactions, and then coming up with a process that then the house can follow.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And Nigel, I think you're best, or you're well placed to answer this one. In terms of technical best practice, what are the primary elements of whole house retrofit and that approach, which are different from the way things are currently done? Done recently.
Kind of addressed this early on, but I'll just add some flavour to it. I think at the moment, if you look at systemised approaches, EWI, cavity wall insulation, with an agreement certificate to a specific system design, this takes it to the next step, and some of the work we're doing now with MQs and standards, understanding in greater detail when at the point of application that your actions could impact on something else. It could impact on what's gone before or what comes after. Take a simple thing, well, not simple thing, but take something like ventilation, where before the standard was always to make no worse. The standard is very much now to improve where you have to improve. So it's the picture, it's a wider context, and guess our aim, and from the IAA point of view, is to take those high-risk measures and get them down into a low-risk category. We do that by developing the systemised approach. We do that by developing the technical best practice, and making sure we've got the right qualifications, and all of them give a very firm nod to whole house retrofit.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to questions from the audience then. So, Peter, you mentioned there that some people saw whole house retrofit as being doing everything at once. Now, the question from Declan Daly, at Tipperary Energy Agency, is which do you think is better, a step-by-step retrofit or all at one time? So it sort of builds on your point there. Which is best?
Okay, well, I think if you can do it all at once, that's much better. And of course, a few people do very deep retrofit all in one go, but it's very expensive. And there are very few householders or landlords in the UK who can afford to do it that way. We always take the opportunity when we can. If we can't, then having a plan to do it step by step rather than doing it random step by step, definitely the second best approach. And that's what we've tried to do with PAS 2035, to say have a plan and then implement it as you can afford it, as the opportunities arise, in accordance with trigger points and so on.
Okay, that's great. A couple of specific questions around the plans. Now, the first is from Alex Woodcraft, a retrofit coordinator from the south of England. He says, how can we check if our medium-term retrofit plans are acceptable? And I think that means acceptable to Trustmark. So I'm going to ask Phil to comment.
Okay, so we're working with our scheme providers. Currently, lodgement to the data warehouse can be made directly into the Trustmark data warehouse by the registered retrofit coordinator. And what we do is we dip into those, the first few that have started to come through, and obviously there's a slowdown now, but there was hundreds starting to come in. So what we do is dip in, have a look, and then conduct an audit against them. And then what we do is pass those back through to the retrofit schemes for them to comment back and work with their member accordingly. So in some instances, we've seen some good things come through. In other instances, we've seen things that may not necessarily be complete. That isn't necessarily to make a comment about the ability or the will of the retrofit coordinator. It may be just more a process of getting comfortable with the lodgement process, and actually getting things into the system. But I think the key to this is to see your retrofit coordinator registration scheme not only as a registration scheme, but as someone that's there to support you and develop standards with you. So really, for me, it's about us auditing them and seeing what's coming through, tracking some trends around it, and seeing if there's things that can be made more easy in the lodgement process, if that's a boundary or hurdle in any other way. And I think really it's about, just to reiterate it really, I think it's about, and there's a noticeable will from the retrofit coordinator schemes, not just to be a registration scheme, but to be a support facility for retrofit coordinators to help them develop and grow and understand and feel more comfortable with the processes that you're expected to follow.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I've had a question here from Ruxandra, who is a retrofit coordinator from Sussex, I think. I'm doing all this from memory, forgive me if I'm wrong. She says, as a retrofit coordinator or designer, is there a body of whom to consult with for technical advice in order to help me comply with PAS 2035? So where would people go to for, obviously they come to the Retrofit Academy for their training, but beyond that, where would you signpost people?
I think I can probably have a first stab at answering that. I think, again, it's about talking to your schemes, but I think there's a responsibility on Trustmark to make sure that the schemes are operating absolutely consistently in terms of content and quality. But something that's started to spring from this, as many of us on the cameras will already be aware of, that there's a PAS integrity group that started to develop to make sure that the delivery of PAS remains on track, but to also sort of canvass some of the questions from industry and some of the wider trends, because there will be the odd few questions in the odd few areas, but if there's wider questions under sort of bigger main headings, then I think that I know not that the entire retrofit community don't have access to the integrity group, but the members of the integrity group, Andre, Peter, you, David, and I, have got an obligation to look at some of those questions, and where there's commonalities in them, I think there's a starting point at the sort of highest level within the integrity group to see how they can be addressed, and where we can feed out some of the information back out through the information sources, as you as the academy, and through the schemes back into industry, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. There's a couple of follow-on questions. Roy Rogers from LMS Services has asked if there's any such thing as a sample medium-term plan. And we've had a question come in from Broadoak, who are an installer in Staffordshire. And they've asked if there are, they said that template designs would be a good idea, which I assume this is talking about details, design detailing and things like that. Are there any resources that we're aware of there?
Well, the contents of a medium-term plan are actually quite simple, and they're set out in section 5.2 of the PAS. So it's not difficult to write a plan that's compliant with the requirements. Whether that's a good plan or not is a different matter. And there are quite a few groups and organizations now setting out to sort of help Trustmark out by saying this is what a good plan would look like, but we're not quite there yet. And in fact, the steering group for PAS 2035 deliberately didn't want to set a format because they felt that the industry would know best how to construct a medium-term plan. I think that's proved not to be the case because nobody's popped up and said, here it is, it's perfect. But I think we are collectively working towards some ideas about what a good one looks like. And I think Phil is right. As soon as we do know what a good one looks like, we should be posting it somewhere and making it available and so on. There is also in PAS 2035 some click-through guidance. If you use the online digital version of PAS 2035 on the BEI website, you can click through clause by clause, including clause 5.0, and get some further advice about how to interpret that clause and how to implement it. So we're slowly getting there, but it's not there yet.
Okay, agreed. It has been, Richard Shears has made a comment here, it's a good point, that there is a retrofit pattern book which was developed up in Greater Manchester by Charlie Baker and others, the Red Co-op. If you Google the retrofit pattern book, it will come up, and it's an excellent resource in which Charlie and others have made available all of the details that they've generated. Peter and myself and the design service that we're helping to build have already said that we will also be populating that. And I'd recommend that other designers and coordinators do the same so that you don't have to reinvent all the wheels all the time. Okay. Some technical questions. There's a question here relating to underfloor insulation and whether certain approaches that may or may not involve robots give rise to issues involving joist rot. Are we aware of any, is there any guidance on that or any research been carried out around that? Nigel and Peter, I think.
Well, obviously, one of the things I do is I help to run the UK Centre for Moisture in Buildings at UCL. So it's kind of close to my heart. Actually, suspended timber floors are high-risk elements of the building. for doing insulation on and for moisture management. The standard only asks us to manage the moisture in a sensible way, which avoids rot and damp and decay and all those kind of things. Of course, in the training course, we deal with joint ends and condensation and those kinds of things. I don't think it's really for me to say which is a good way of doing it and which isn't at the moment, but there are techniques, and there is CP available, which I think we will not in the not too distant future be making available to retrofit coordinators on moisture issues, and that's coming out of the UK Centre for Moisture in Buildings amongst other sources. So it's kind of watch this really. I know the guys who do underfloor insulation by taking the floor, putting stuff in between the joists, and I know the guys who do it with robots, and there are swings and roundabouts, or there are good advantages and disadvantages to both methods. I think of it doing the floor as one of those bullets like solid wall insulation. For a long time, we didn't bite the bullet of solid wall insulation because it was expensive and a bit risky, and we moved on to solid wall insulation. Now we need to bite the next bullet, which is to do the floors, and they're equally complicated, disruptive, and risky, and we just need to embrace those problems and deal with them technically.
Nigel, I know you were commissioned to write some guidance by BEIS on this subject, I think.
Yeah, that's right. We've just completed a piece of work which is now back with BEIS on technical best practice for underfloor insulation. It's worth noting that actually there is only one system for underfloor insulation approved at the moment, and that is the robot one. It's got an agreement certificate against it. The guidance is not about specific systems, it's about the approach. It's about identifying, in particular, the go, no-go areas, such as the moisture content of the timber, such as your subfloor ventilation, such as your simple things like your relative height of the interior floor compared to the external floor. Link that to, again, the work on the National Occupational Standards Group, and the aim is then to drive up the standard of judgment that takes place before that work is carried out. So that will be available soon. It is unlike any other technical best practice written before, in that it tries to cover a number of areas where before we focused on the operative and the installer technician. This covers all the way back from the design stage, the assessment stage. So a powerful document, I think, when it hits the street, and should be out. Andre, what's your views on when it will be out?
Well, so it's down to me. Well, it's sort of down to me in as much as I need to chivvy people along within BEIS to get it published. But yeah, so the content is finalised. It's being written by Colin King, but this is just for everyone else's benefit, not just to answer your question, Nige. And yeah, I'd like to publish it in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay, fantastic. We're going to move on after this one final question, which is how do you judge whether mechanical ventilation is essential when EWI or IWI is installed? So I think that's specifically, it's not asking about ventilation full stop, it's mechanical ventilation.
So there are very clear criteria in PAS 2035 about when you need to go to continuous ventilation rather than intermittent, and there are similar criteria in Part F of the building regs and Part L1B, and there are similar criteria coming out in the new Part L1B and Part F in due course. So it's actually fairly clear, and it's all mostly around the air tightness of the building envelope. And if there is a risk that you're going to make the air tightness of the building envelope currently lower than 5 cubic meters per square meter per hour at 50 pascals, then you need to move to continuous ventilation, which I would interpret as mechanical ventilation.
Okay, that's great. Okay, we're going to do another one of our polls now, and I'll throw a couple of questions to the panel whilst that the voting is in process. So let's get it going. Okay, so I hope now you see the whole house retrofit polls on screen. A question I get asked quite a lot, and I'll put it on behalf of the retrofit coordinators and particularly the installers. A lot of installers at the moment are installers of 1 or 2 or 3 measures, but not necessarily potentially installers of multiple measures. So what do they do in a circumstance where a medium-term retrofit plan says that the measures that they install are not necessarily the best place, is not necessarily the best place to start? What does it mean for them?
I can have a start on that if you like. I think we've got to be very, very careful here, because if a plan's been created and we don't follow the plan, there's an implication for the retrofit coordinator in terms of claiming compliance, but also there's the implication of sort of completely undermining the principle of PAS 2035, that if we don't start to work to the plans, and if we don't start to change the mindset and take a house on a dwelling on a home on a journey, nothing's really going to change, because the plan's there for a reason. And I suppose perhaps a strange example, but if I've asked somebody to come and paint the front of my house and I'd like it painted blue, and I come home and they've painted it pink, it's been painted, but it just hasn't been done in accordance with client requirements. And that's what the retrofit coordinator is there to do, is to manage the client requirements. So it's about doing the measures, carrying out the measures in the right order in accordance with the plan. So for me to undermine the plan is an absolute no-no. And I don't think, compliance can't be claimed if the plan simply hasn't been followed. And that's one of the things that through the Trustmark auditing and the scheme provider auditing that they will carry out with their own membership, that we need to be ensured, and we need, again, I use this phrase a lot, track trends. We need to establish how plans are being deviated from, if they are, and understand the reasons why. Because simply, if we just if a coordinator's contracted with an organisation that has a limited range of measures and they're not in the priority of the plan, there needs to be a broader delivery chain to be able to deliver things in accordance with the plan.
Okay.
I'll just add to that remind us that the plan is actually agreed by the retrofit coordinator with the client. So the plan should be reflecting the client's wishes. So it would be a brave person who went off in a different direction, painted it pink instead.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So we've got the results of our poll here. The question 2 is a theme I want to raise specifically, but the question of will whole house retrofit be the norm by the end of 2021? I suspect I was being slightly ambitious in saying it would be the norm, but 12% say it will be, an encouraging 75% saying in part. So, but perhaps there'll be a transition with eco and then the rest of the sector transitioning. 13% still saying no, we'll be doing very much as we've always done, or the individual measures will still rule. So a sense that something's that changes afoot. Now, this question point 2 around RDSAP. This was a question that Guy Ritson had raised, and others have raised too. It is really about how appropriate RDSAP is to make decisions, to make decisions for a particular property. And these results are interesting. So we've got retrofit coordinators here saying, almost half of them here on this call saying they wouldn't use RDSAP alone to make decisions. Now, I know that's not a view shared by some of the Trustmark approved schemes at the moment. 39% saying, no, it's not ideal, but we'll live with it. And 13% is more than adequate. Any reflections on that point?
Yeah, and I think I would like to point out that the assessment that's PAS 2035 is a lot more than the energy efficiency assessment, which we've allowed RDSAP to be used for reluctantly. It involves the context of the dwelling, the condition of the dwelling, the energy performance of the dwelling, and the ventilation of the dwelling are all part of the assessment. And all of those together are what the decisions are made on. We had to accept RDSAP because it's the industry norm, but I think it would be fair to say a lot of the steering group were reluctant to accept. That's why PAS 2035 has several alternatives, using full SAP, using PHPP, and so on. And it actually encourages people to do that. The improved adoption evaluation has to be done with full SAP or PHPP. So I think if you like, the implicit objective of the standard is to push people away from RDSAP because we don't believe it's accurate enough, towards some more accurate tools, but acknowledging that actually a lot of the industry use RDSAP at the moment, so it would be difficult to just ban it straight away.
Okay. Okay, fine.
David, just quickly jump in and just link it to the earlier question as well about the installer primary measure not being the best place to start. if we get anything out of this, and hence, and this is why we need this consistency across the market as a whole, we've got to move away from the funding regime that means that somebody does a relatively insignificant measure to unlock a much more profitable measure. This has got to be about what's appropriate for the building. And I would, of course, say that that's got to start with fabric first. Get the building fabric right, then think about what else you can do to build on that. But hopefully this will take us to a point where we're actually doing what's appropriate at the right time for the building, as opposed to what's appropriate to get the maximum amount of cash out of the bank.
Okay, thank you. Very important point. Just finish off on this poll. Then this is an interesting one. So we've got 67% of coordinators saying that they feel, at least to an extent, uneasy with it being their signature signing off on compliance on a project. Now that may, of course, be that we haven't done much of this yet, and people don't know how it works in full. But I think certainly something we need to take note of and try and build confidence. You know that they've got big issues around insurance, clearly. And perhaps, well, I don't know, perhaps we need to do a bit more research around that.
I just add there that actually it's the house that complies, not the retrofit coordinator, and the that's done to the house either complies or it doesn't. What the retrofit coordinator does is assemble the evidence from the project documentation that it does comply, and then Trustmark assesses that evidence to decide whether they're prepared to accept it. So actually, it's not really completely down to the retrofit coordinator. It's down to the coordinator to make sure that all the other people in the team do what they're supposed to do, and then they provide evidence to support that they have done that. And I don't think that they're, you know, it's not the retrofit coordinator's signature which is the issue. It's whether or not they've assembled the evidence correctly.
Agreed, but we've got 67% of respondents uneasy, so yeah. I'm sure there's a solution. Okay, let's move on to the final section then before we throw it open to more questions. And this is, I suppose, the exciting bit. It's all about the future market for whole house retrofit. What do we want that to look like? And also the energy company obligation. Let's start with a question here to Andre, if I may, which is, could you give us a flavour? Obviously, we're retrofitting all of this stuff into Eco3, whereas we're going to have a new, we think, Eco4 in 2022. So could you perhaps comment on the likely direction you think that might take? I appreciate there's lots of things you probably can't say, but what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, there are things, I can say lots of things. It's how certain that they will happen, I suppose. What I can say is that, obviously, ultimately, it is up to ministers what direction we go in. But from my perspective, I am clear that we will be recommended to change direction, so to move away from what we have now, which is that sort of chasing the money in single measure approach, and moving much more towards an approach which, so obviously, as Peter says, it doesn't mean, PAS 2035 doesn't mean you have to do all the measures in one go, but we certainly want to move to a scenario where if that's possible, and if it's government funded, whether it's through ECO or something else, we want to take those homes up as high as possible, the efficiency scale. And that's because simply there isn't, we've got targets for 2030, targets for 2035. We haven't got time from the early to mid 2020s to then revisit those homes multiple times. We've had that argument for the last 10 years, or since ECO started. We've been able to argue, well, actually, you know, you might get innovation that reduces the prices of XYZ measures, and therefore, even if you have to revisit a home, the price of that visit will be exceeded by the cost saving you make through innovation. I think that argument starts to go away, but also we're now much more conscious of having to do the measures in a more coordinated way, becoming much more aware of the risks of not doing that. So certainly from my perspective, future recommendations to ministers would be that we move to a multi-measure approach. We will certainly be looking at the scoring mechanism. I think that the high costs are of search under ECO at the moment are an outcome of not just the eligibility criteria, but also of the scoring mechanism, which incentivizes people to go for the largest homes. So I think that's the sorts of things that I would like to move towards are much more multi-measure, where whether it's a small terrace house or a large 5-bed house, it should be equally attractive to installers, and also, if we can, to some extent, at least move to a system where we monitor and reward people for actual in situ performance. And that, I think, is going to be a big challenge, but that's certainly an ambition for me and the team, is to find a way of doing that, and thereby really providing the incentive for people to maximize quality, to innovate as well, and not just demonstrate compliance of what's required, but go beyond where that's practical.
Okay, thank you. I've been sitting on a question from Adrian Wright from Happy Energy for a little while, and it's probably most appropriate to ask it now. It refers to the existing ECO rather than the future ECO, but nonetheless, it's really, he's asking whether you can get the uplift available, the 20% uplift available on things like solar PV and heat pumps, given that they're sort of covered by the MCS rather than the PAS standards. Do we know the answer to that one?
Oh, that's a good question, Adrian. Thanks for that. I'd have to check actually whether, if it's not covered under the PASs, then actually technically they may not be included, because that would come down to the that legislation is drafted in the context of PAS 2035 PAS 2019 standards. So it may not be included, but that's something to come back to.
We'll come back on that one then. That's fine.
But I can just clarify that a little bit.
Yeah.
Those projects are covered by PAS 2035. They're just not covered by PAS 2030, because the MCS standards are an alternative at the installation stage to PAS 2030. They're not an alternative to the design stage at PAS 2035, or to the process stage part of it.
Okay, great. Here's a very, very good question. I'm afraid I didn't make a note of who asked it, but you'll know if you're on the call. It says that retrofit coordinator services make sense for portfolios or estates, but how can we make it work in financial terms, economic terms, for single owner occupiers? How do we make it stack up?
It's an interesting question, because in fact nearly everything that's in PAS 2025 came out of experience that goes back to single dwellings, starting with Retrofit for the Future and moving on there, and individual dwellings through ECO. So if there's a lack of experience behind in the standards, it's for doing it at scale. So I would say that there shouldn't be a problem implementing for individuals. It obviously puts the price up, but it means you get a good job. That's the whole point. And one of the purposes, as I said at the beginning, of having PAS 2035 was to give the individual householder confidence that they were going to get a good job out of the industry. And remember that 68% of the 25 million plus houses out there we've got to deal with, that's the challenge, are actually owner occupied. So this has to work for owner occupiers.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, I think there's a lot of gaming and calculations being done around those things right now. I think this is a good one for Phil Mason, because I know Trustmark are involved in various finance groups and what have you. The question is, are finance providers now requiring PAS 2035 as a condition of loans and mortgages? And if not, do we know when this is likely to happen?
Right, okay. The answer to that is it's not a requirement now. although we talk to the Green Finance Institute, and we talk to financiers on a sort of more local and individual level, and they're all very drawn to the fact that they are collectively trying to work up green finance initiatives, either green finance, either green mortgages or green loans. And when I talk about loans, they're probably more in the sort of secured loans area. And what they're really attracted to is the fact that collectively the finance industry is trying to move towards greener offerings that actually achieve something, rather than just being called green in name, that there's a mechanism to actually justify that they are green lending mechanisms. And the thing that they are really attracted to, and I won't pretend that every finance organization that I speak to understands the full detail of PAS 2035, but what they do understand is that there's a method of reducing risk of default on payment, leaving them with risk, and they understand the fact that it's being monitored for compliance. So they take confidence from that. So there's a lot of interest around it for two reasons. Firstly, it helps them, just to reiterate the point, I suppose, it helps them get to being able to deliver green finance with a justification for its title, and it brings down their risk. A question that I can't answer is when will that happen, because that's for the finance industry to make a decision. But we continuously bang the drum. There's some very, very receptive organizations listening to it, and I think it's about driving them to a place that they understand and feel comfortable with about how the PAS actually benefits them in terms of reducing this risk. And I think there's some wide understanding of it. We'll continue that conversation. Do I think it's days, weeks or months away? No. I think we can probably talk in terms of a year or perhaps more, but that day is on its way and it's being driven for the right reasons.
Yeah. I think that's a debate we need to keep the coordinators informed on.
Indeed.
Which we will help with. Okay. A couple of questions around sort of supply chain shortages. Specific one, Richard Frith asked the question. He says, there a significant problem with retrofit is to get reliable accredited trades signed up. How is this progressing? So I think this is getting at sort of subcontractors and sort of the labour force. And the another question, related question, is some roles in the process are in short supply or missing. What is happening to bring designers and evaluators to the table? Anyone want to tackle those?
Well, I'll have a go at the second one. We are training retrofit coordinators in some of the basic principles of evaluation, so they can do that, so they can be evaluators. And as I said earlier, we are working on a standard for building performance evaluation, which will set up some training procedures and some qualifications. Whether people will buy them, that's another matter, of course. So I think we're slowly getting there. Designers, the qualifications for designers are largely qualifications that exist out there. Architects, architectural technologists, members of the CIOB, building professionals and so on. So there's no reason for them to be in short supply. They may not be used to working in this sector, but that's for the sector to deal with and to bring them in.
Okay, and the first point around sort of labour shortages. Any views on that?
Crikey, that's a big question, because what we've got to do is I think collectively as a sector, I mean, what we're actually doing now is probably paying for the underinvestment in the sector over the years. There's been, and that all seems to have come to a head at one point, because it's historically people have probably wanted to go off into IT or some of what they consider to be some of the more creative trades. Or professions than they have wanted to come into the construction industry. So that's a big old nut to crack, to be honest with you, all round. I don't think there's an easy answer for it, but I think I think what's happening now in terms of COVID and all the control that's in place about what's happening isn't helping it. But out of an awful situation like this, sometimes opportunity comes, because I think there might be people now that are realizing that the industries they might already be working in that might be allied to it, they can see that there might be opportunities in in delivering quality services in a quality sector. But I think the way that we approach it, and I think that's the responsibility of all of us in the panel, is to keep engaging with the industry and keep expressing the processes and the benefits that there are to be achieved with it. And the higher the profile and the higher the quality that you raise of an industry, the more attractive that often becomes to people outside it. If there was any question over it in the past, we're now starting to remove it, and it starts to take some of those situations away, which is encouraging when people want to participate in a sector. They want to work in a sector they're proud of.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
I think we could also bat that question a little bit towards Andre, because one of the reasons that people have been not investing in the skills and equipment needed and not investing in the training has been inconsistency in the policy. If we had consistent government policy with a big stride to it, I think more people would get into the industry and invest in the training and qualifications, and more companies would get into the sector because they could see a work stream ahead of them. In the past, we've had a lot of stop-start, which has pushed people out, and that's not really helpful. But Andre knows that, so he may want to comment.
Okay, we can't get too bogged down on this point, I'm afraid. I'm going to do the survey for this section now, because a lot of the other questions that have been asked relate to what should people be charging for their service and what will the market bear. And actually, no one knows the answer to this. So this poll may just be the first step in helping work it out. So let's get that poll up. Okay, so you should now be seeing poll 3, the future market. Okay, and again, we'll give that a couple of minutes for people to have a look through. This is totally anonymous, by the way, so we have no idea who said what. So don't think we're getting any intelligence out of this. Okay, so we've had quite a lot of questions also which relate to how would I go about developing a business model around this? How would we're a retrofit coordinator, we've gone and gained the qualification. How might we go about, setting, what advice would the panel give to people looking to set up that sort of service? How would you recommend that they get themselves going? We've also had a very interesting question from Helen Rooney, who's a social landlord from memory. And she's asked about whether there is a list of approved whole house retrofit contractors that could be called upon. I don't believe that there is, but I'm going to throw that one at the panel too. Perhaps there should be.
Okay. In terms of how do you build a business around this? For me, that you've got to build your supply chain. You've got to build your confidence and your relationships with your supply chains, because I think the world goes round by relationship and trust. So for when you're able to build that, your service offering is greater. If you're just a retrofit coordinator in isolation and you're not connected with the supply chain, you've got a challenge of fulfilling the service that you've got. And I think you need really to be working with broad supply chains, so that when a whole house deep retrofit that's to be done in one go comes along, that you're actually able to offer that service and furnish it from beneath with the trades that are required to do so. How do you do that? Well, I think that this is possibly something the industry can help with, in terms of forums where there's sort of introductory forums and networking type forums for installers to understand. In one corner stand all the retrofit coordinators, and for the retrofit coordinators to see in that corner over there sit the supply chains that you're reliant on, as we're reliant on each other, and actually bringing people together. I don't like the phrase sort of dating agency applied to these sort of circumstances, but it is about people building their networks and building their understanding, and being able to then move to a sort of more consistent model of being able to deliver services, so that you can get into sort of competitive pricing packages and value for money and things like that. But I think it starts with building good, trustworthy supply chains beneath you.
Okay, and on that subject of trust, is there such a thing as a list of sort of endorsed whole house retrofit installers?
Okay, what we have in Trustmark are the lists of the individual trades. What I think we can possibly start to think about working on are being able to look at how we could publish something informative for the industry and for the consumer to take some of the issues away in trying to actually piece together a supply chain. If there are organisations that offer broad levels of services, to work towards being able to produce a one-stop, I mean, that's easy for you to say, a one-stop shop type list, I think is something that's been on our radar for a while. And I think we need to look at how we can do that to generally support a bit more, because lots and lots of small sub-inquiries become quite a difficult thing to manage, and just be able to go to one place to start building that relationship is something I think Trustmark can potentially help with.
Okay, interesting. Okay, let's take a look at the survey results. Some quite interesting results. So the first question is the first and second question are effectively asking the same question, except the first question is saying, what do you think the market would value this service at? Now, I have to say, I was expecting this to come out much lower. But the average result there on question 1 appears to be between £340 and £499. Now, there's obviously the assumption made here is a single property. The service is the Retrofit Coordinator service, so not the energy assessment bit at the start. And it was 5 measures, so a fairly deep retrofit. So we'd certainly be looking at sort of a pathway B. You know, but the rest of the coordinator service. So that's coming out between £300 and £500, the average get, but equally 23% saying between £500 and £750, and 6% saying £750 or above. Only 8% saying under 100, and 27 between 100 and £299. That's interesting. And then in terms of what would you expect to charge as the coordinator based on the same set of assumptions, it's a fairly good match there, I think. 31% in that bracket, 300 to 499. So then 13% saying 750 or above. So quite a bit higher there. And that doesn't surprise me particularly. This is the other side of the equation. A question I know we're keen to know the answer to, we're all keen to know, is how many retrofit coordinators do we need? I never go to an event without that question being asked. And it's almost impossible to answer it without having these sort of variables sort of known so that you can feed into the equations. So how many coordinator projects would you expect to take on at any one time? The average there is 4 to 6. So that would suggest that's assuming a full-time individual, they'd expect to be working on 4 to 6 projects. So they feel that there's quite a lot involved in those projects. Interestingly, and perhaps reflecting the fact that we've got sort of the smaller owner-occupier side of people on the call, and also the eco market working at scale, we've got 16% there saying over 15 projects at a time. So we'll have to chew those over. Any reflections on those numbers?
I've got a view around some of this. I think in terms of some of the pricing figures that we've got in here is what do you think you can expect to charge, and again, the value of the services viewed by a consumer. I think they're always going to be slightly different things, aren't they? That a customer, the public will want to pay less. And I think it's important that the industry reacts to make sure that the pricing levels are realistic for the delivery of the service. We cannot, I know that the phrase goes around quite a lot, but we cannot start a race to the bottom to be in a reverse auction for the cheapest services taking on the work, because that will reflect on quality, I believe. But in terms of price points, I think as we go forward, I know that I speak to a number of organisations that are working up sort of digital tools to help the delivery. And sometimes when I see things being worked out on spreadsheets, they can be very quite a lengthy sort of process in order to get an end result out of it. But if as an industry we're starting to build reliable digital tools that help the delivery, they can bring down the time against it and drive up the efficiency. And I think that has two things. I think it has an impact on on keeping the cost at a manageable level that a consumer can understand and is happy with. But also, I think the more digital tools that are available, I think there's a good argument there for the more projects you could expect to undertake because you've got tools to help you deliver them. Now, at the moment, it's a bit of an open-ended question, but what is fairly interesting now is that those figures are coming up at one of the lights at the end. So, to the top of it in terms of numbers that will be whole to see everything can be charged at less than 100.
Sorry, Phil. Is everyone else hearing that static too? Was it just me?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I'm sure it was nothing you did, but let's just move on if we can. Any other reflections from the rest of the panel?
Observation, and that is for the market to sort itself out ultimately, and we'll start off with what we think is an effective pricing point, and people will shift their focus. I think there's a couple of things to remember. This applies to ECO only at the moment, and therefore whatever the BEIS IA says is what's being sold to the energy companies and the government in terms of what the cost of compliance will be. Overlay on that on the ridiculous costs for generation at the moment and the cost of the measure for that. Put ventilation on top of that as well. And then when the market does sort itself out, it's incumbent on Trustmark, it's incumbent on all of us really, to make sure that where there is a very low price point and there is a approach that makes good use of infrastructure and IT, that is policed effectively, and that we don't promote the race to the bottom. So it's incumbent to make sure that when the price point is low, we take a good look at why the price point is low. While it's high, we take a good look at that and we let the market sort itself out. But where we failed in the past is the policemen have failed to police effectively, and that we've got to sort out.
I think Trustmark is able to comment. I'm not sure if we can comment on people's business models and how they charge what and why, but we have to be very, very focused on what the outputs are to make sure the outputs are consistently. I think it's a point well made as well, Nigel. I think it's absolutely critical to the success of this that the standards are retained high, and people. Organisations should reap the benefit of delivering high standards as well. They should be rewarded accordingly.
Okay, we're getting lots more questions in now, so I'm going to bring that section to an end, and I'll just whiz through the questions that have been sent in, and then I'll ask the delegates to see if they've got any further questions. We may even let people unmute their mics, but we'll see if they behave. So, okay, question from Tim Freeman. He says, with regards to Eco4 and funding in general, we are in the early stages of a catastrophic world financial crash. Yes, I think that's true. I simply don't believe there will be any additional government funding available to install multi-measures when governments around the world will be spending at least the next decade trying to mitigate the impacts of today. We all need to realise now that the world has fundamentally changed. There will now be many millions of potential new customers under ECO due to unemployment. With regards to CO2 emissions, we need to get the country off gas and look at the gas scoring to stop making it attractive. I think that's a statement rather than a question. I'm sorry, I didn't see the end of it before, but I mean, it really begs, I suppose the question inherent in that is there still going to be a market left at the end of ECO? The end of COVID? An industry and a market?
I can answer the internet.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's hard to tell at the moment, isn't it? I think the thing is a lot of it's going to hit different people very differently. I'll be interested to see, for example, what is the demographic of the people who are claiming universal credit. That will expand the eligible pool even under the current ECO. But if those people are, for example, predominantly young renters, then they disproportionately, or they don't proportionately benefit from ECO, for example, as a group. So there may be quite a lot of new people who qualify theoretically. Whether they actually, that pool will necessarily be smaller because of the type of people they are, the types of homes they live in, especially if they're in smaller homes, as I mentioned earlier, that they're not as viable. And then the wider question is, well, there won't be money available. I think even if it's the same amount of money available, or even a small amount of money available, we would still recommend moving to a different approach. It's not a requirement to have many billions more for us to be persuaded that this approach is necessary. So yes, we would have to treat fewer homes with the same amount of money, but that would nevertheless be, I think, the right approach. Obviously, the politics of what will happen in the next few years will be important to the decisions, and perhaps ministers won't want to treat fewer homes, but certainly from our perspective as the people advising them on what the right approach is, that's what we would go with.
Okay, I think Tim's having a tough time, but I mean, go on, Nigel.
David, can I just add to it and throw in a bit of an industry balance response, really, and that is, my last calculation, we're nearly 1.5 million that are on universal credit, and Andrew's right, the mix of them people is very important. But let's not forget those who are being furloughed as well and taking salary sacrifices, salary reductions. There's a naive belief that they're having to do less, so they're spending less, but they've got school children to entertain, they've got to cover that cost of being at home and the greater energy usage. They've got to feed them. It's not what we think it is going to be, and we're going to find more and more people are moving into that fuel poverty bracket, or they're getting into debt and they're taking mortgage relief holidays and things like that. The danger is actually we just forget about eco and we start thinking about, well, how can we subsidise them and how can we be short term? We've got to focus long term, because I don't think the next generation will let us avoid a climate crisis. So what we do now, while we try to respond and deal with the circumstances of COVID-19, we can't take our eye off net zero 2050. Eco 4 is got to see an industry that is constructed in a different way. The small tradesmen that installed single installation measures in the future may not be around after that. The volume and numbers we've got left in this industry is worrying if we're going to deliver energy efficiency. And if all we've done is an eco program and a lesser eco program, and we don't get legislation, we don't start pushing people to do the right thing with carrot and stick, we won't have an industry. We won't come back to this. So what we do now, we can't take our eye off the ball. What we do now is really important to make sure we can deliver any of this, let alone a whole house approach. Off my soapbox now, Tim.
Thank you very much. Julian, I think it must be Julian Boss, has asked a question here. I'll just paraphrase it because it's quite lengthy, but he's really asking whether BEIS would consider a national advertising campaign to try and build consumer awareness and confidence in our new supply chain, our new approaches.
Tough one, because so generally advertising campaigns are a big no-no within government, and the Green Deal advertising campaign is maybe sort of overshadows what may be possible in this sphere. So that was the last time really that money was spent to market a policy related to energy efficiency. So, I mean, it's not impossible, but there's quite a lot of skepticism about whether things like that work. Yeah. I think is the current position.
Okay. There's also there is a flip side to Tim Freeman's point. Tim says he agrees. I'm not sure what he's agreeing with, but hopefully. The flip side to the argument is that coming out of this, there'll be a need to invest in infrastructure and sort of increased resilience. And Martin here has made a very good point about the renewed focus on social care and the impact that retrofit can help on reducing the dependence of society on social care and aging population and all those sorts of things. So do you think there is a prospect of domestic retrofit being a beneficiary of a green revolution, a green New Deal?
So I would love to think so, and you know there are absolutely so it's government thinking about how we're going to need an economic stimulus. I take the point that everyone's going to be skint, but we are going to need a short-term stimulus to bounce out of this very deep slump, and domestic retrofit ticks a lot of the boxes. So net zero is definitely being lined up as, this is the opportunity, and the International Energy Agency, many international commentators are saying this is an opportunity to grow out of this differently to how we did 10 years ago. And domestic retrofit ticks more boxes than, for example, massive investment in nuclear, because it's spread throughout the country. You've got the areas that are probably going to be most hit by this are already the areas that are poor and we're on the agenda for levelling up. You've got lots of local businesses. We're going to need to help those areas which also coincide with some of the worst housing. So I think there is definitely an opportunity, and you could even perhaps see a scenario where people have noticed, albeit we've moved into warmer weather relatively quickly, people may have noticed what it's like being in their home whilst it's colder for more of the time. They may notice things that need doing. So yes, I think there are lots of negatives, but we are certainly within BEIS trying to look at positives, and we will be putting forward to ministers reasons why domestic retrofit and doing it right can help with social care and NHS and independent living and all those things that the government is absolutely become even more acutely aware of.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, there's one final question here, but it's quite long and I haven't read it yet. So I'm going to ask if there's anyone who's brave enough to turn on their microphone or unmute themselves and ask a question directly to the panel, and we'll see how it goes. So the next person to speak, introduce yourself and pose your question. Anyone feeling brave? Perhaps Tim Freeman could, because it's your question.
I will indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, David.
Hi.
Yeah, I think, listen, unfortunately I had a power cut about 20 minutes in, and it took about 10 minutes to get back on, so I missed a part of this, unfortunately, but I'm glad it's been recorded. I feel my comment is a bit sort of gloom-laden, shall we say, but what we're experiencing over the last few weeks, today, tomorrow, for the next few months, maybe even years, is unprecedented. This is akin to the economic crash of 1929. This is era-defining stuff. And yes, I fully appreciate that we've got all these things in place, the frameworks to deliver on, but everything suddenly changed. And the framework's still there. I want to be an optimist, but I'm not going to be an optimist because I'm being a realist. The funding has to be there in some way or other, whether it's from government and alone or from the private sector in association with the government, to enable this to happen. The polls on the charges, the costs that retrofit coordinators would think to charge, I hit every single one of those with the majority, because I take the view that if you need a structural surveyor's report on a property, which is something they do once for that property, you are going to be paying several £100, £300-400, and yet the retrofit coordinator role is one that has more liability attached to it, I think. The bits I heard from Peter is exactly right. Our role is to make sure that the information we're given is correct, but there's always going to be a minority out there who try to work around every safeguard you put into a process.
Okay,
But I think
let's get the question in if we could, please.
Yeah, well, I think it's just, I don't know, I suppose I put it in my thing. I put another reply to you. I said I agree with Nigel's view that the industry is being decimated as we stand here, and Andre's view that we'll need additional funding. I think we're going to have to become very lean and fast moving with the amount of time PAS has taken to put together. I suppose the question is, as an industry, given these extraordinary circumstances, we've seen the Formula One teams come in a week and get through regulation procedures that take years normally, because suddenly government said this needs to happen. Actually, we have a climate emergency on our hands that's far greater than COVID. It needs to happen, and we need a responsive government that acts much faster. It's not a question, it's a statement, but it might be for discussion.
It is. But I don't think we can speak for ministers. It would be good to hear from Andre's ministerial associates.
Actually, I do have one question, David. This is a quick one. Insurance. Is there a mechanism that Trustmark in particular could look at to do with a DEA, a pay-per-click insurance, depending on if housing stock was categorized in certain ways, to avoid this confusion out there on the insurance side for coordinators? So if you're doing 3 measures down path B, whatever it is, bang, you're going to pay £100 for that. Or not £100, you know what I mean? But there's a scale there.
It's a very, very interesting concept, because we talk about financial protection for the customer, and that's not on a pay-for-click methodology. That's to purchase approved financial protection against the job. But it's a very, very, very interesting concept. The answer is I don't know. The other part of that answer is I think we need to go and discuss and have an internal think about how we might do it. We are connected to some insurance companies, and see how we might be able to support the industry with the delivery of something like that. I think there'll be a lot of sort of risk algorithms and all sorts of things going on in the background, but I think that's a really interesting suggestion, Tim, and I would certainly, I won't claim it for mine, but I would certainly take that suggestion away and see how we can look at it, because there's a really good point of contact where that can actually be serviced, I think, as well, and it's at the point of lodgement.
Great, happily be involved in that discussion with you.
Yeah,
thank you, Tim, and we'll certainly.
Tim's earlier comment as well. Sorry, we've written as an installation industry to BEIS and to the minister. I think it's important we keep that dialogue going. We work together to try and see what comes out of this and what might come out of it. The other thing we've started to do is pull together some guidance on actually what a return to work looks like and when it's appropriate. Taking the lead from not taking the lead from the Construction Leadership Council. I like to think we're ahead of the game than them, really. We're starting to understand when it's appropriate to go to work and what measures you can take to make sure you protect the vulnerable in society that we're trying to help. I'm looking at different ways and approaches to surveillance, so remote surveillance, looking at different ways towards guarantee claims for the consumer. The important part is there as an energy efficiency body and working with government on solutions to help work, ideas that they might want to take forward.
Yeah, perhaps we could have a body via the Retrofit Academy for the Retrofit Coordinators to give one coordinated, excuse the pun, voice that can be fed back to Andre and the government ministers for helping to shape policy moving forward. Because I think if people think like me, I want to be putting into, giving my penny's worth to help move the process forward and make it better for everybody.
Would that be helpful? Do we have a view on whether that would be a helpful thing for the Academy to do? To help the coordinator community speak with one voice? Or are there already organisations that can do that? No?
I think there's none of us got all the ideas. We're actually having having a body of people who've got some ideas and got some thoughts, and recognise that there's some certain limitations around that, particularly around the eco side of it. But I think that's helpful and powerful. And I'm speaking as if I'm BEIS, but actually, I think government haven't got this cupboard full of ideas that they can just shake out and pull off. So I think we need to be continuing to have a dialogue. We need to be thinking about not just the ask, but actually where's the benefit? What can we do? What can we do long term? We've often been criticised for going there and complaining as opposed to going there with the oven-ready ideas, and we've got to have more of them.
Okay. Well, we'll chew that over. There's a couple of people who've texted some positive noises around that idea. So thank you, Tim. It's not the first time we've thought of it, but I've never really felt the time's been right, but perhaps it is now. We'll have a look at it. Thank you very much. I think I'd like to keep it to time. Comment from Catherine, could it not be through the WG? I'm not sure. Is that the Welsh Government? WG Grace? Not sure. You'll have to clarify what that is. Working group.
It might be working group.
Possibly. It's that, Catherine. Okay. I'd just like to thank our panelists. Thanks. You've given 2 hours of your time. I know that's a lot. I feel it's been a very worthwhile exercise, and we haven't had the technical disasters we could have done. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope our delegates have taken something from it. We'll probably do some form of survey to check. We will also send round a recording of this when we've tidied it up. And any of the questions we haven't been able to fully answer, and there are quite a few of those I've made a note of, and we'll discuss them. I think we've got another PAS group meeting tomorrow and another coordinator working group meeting next week. So we'll see where those get to, and we'll keep you informed. But thank you very, very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.